This is the Independence Day weekend special Idea of India debate. As India celebrates 73 years of independence, has the vision of the founding mothers and fathers been diluted? Or is the new India idea building simply a better India for tomorrow? It's a contentious issue to debate in the polarized times in which we live. We have two very special guests, both a rare breed of public intellectual politicians. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Congress Member of Parliament, is with us and author of several books. And Dr. Swapan Das Gupta, the BJP's Rajya Sabha member and also an author. Thank you both very much for joining me. The rules are going to be very simple. In keeping with the spirit of the times, there will be no cross-talk. I will give equal time to each participant and ensure that they get their point heard. That's the way we want to do debates in this new era that faces us. I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Das Gupta, first, because you are from the ruling party, and I therefore want to ask you the question that is posed often. The criticism that the BJP and Mr. Modi or Mr. Modi's India or Moditva is about a majoritarian India. It's about an India of unequal citizenship that will eventually lead to a Hindu Rashtra, and the fear is a series of actions over the last 12 months have created that impression. Your first opening remarks on that issue.
I think this is a rather facile argument which has been put forward by people who, for various reasons, have been dispossessed from power. What we've seen in the past 6 years or so has been the evolution of what you call the idea of India. It's never been a static idea, and there's never been a singular idea. These are ideas which have been evolving, and today what we've got is twofold. One, we always had the Constitution, but there were certain ideas which which govern that constitutional, what is called the constitutional morality. And that was the notion of the Nehruvian consensus. What we have achieved in the past 5-6 years has been a shift away from that into something resembling an assertion of popular sovereignty. And I think it's this aspect which is a greater democratization of the center and the incorporation of the sentiments of the people of India into the larger process of decision making. And that negation of purely the rule of an elite has probably disturbed a few people. And what we've seen again is more an assertion not of disaggregated citizenship, but an assertion of equal citizenship marked by the abrogation of Article 370. Today we can say that almost every citizen of India, beginning from Kashmir right down to Kanyakumari, today has the same rights and the same privileges which are accrued to everyone. And gradually this is coming into the realms of personal laws as well. The principles governing personal laws, it's not one personal law, but the principles governing personal laws are coming in. So we have seen a shift, but I think it's this notion of equal citizenship and popular sovereignty, which I think defines this.
So you're telling me, Dr. Das Gupta, in 12 months, which has seen the abolition of Article 370, which has seen the Citizenship Amendment Act, which has seen the Mandir Nirman, you are telling me that all these are steps towards equal citizenship and reflecting popular sovereignty. Am I correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's one view. Therefore, I want to turn to the other view, which is yours, Dr. Tharoor. Give us your sense of why you believe that in 2020, the idea of India is under threat. Why do you believe that? The very notion of a Nehruvian consensus, as Dr. Das Gupta has put it, is that under threat, or is the idea of India under threat?
Yeah, I was a bit taken aback by saying this was facile and that there's really no notion of nationhood embedded in the Constitution. There very much is. In fact, the Constitution was the actual legal reflection of the idea of India that the rest of us are talking about. It was not a policy consensus of a particular government or prime minister. It was the fact that the constitution was written for a country that was meant to be structured on a pluralistic principle with a lot of emphasis on citizens' freedoms, where the individual was empowered to have a sense of his or her own political destiny through freedom to vote, to express their opinions, to practice religions that they wish and to propagate them as well. And in other words, the Constitution created an idea of India that said India is a plural society with their multiple identities functioning: language, caste, creed, region, as well as, of course, the question of how exactly one may choose to worship. All of this was supposed to coexist within that constitutional framework and without any one particular group having dominance. In fact, in addition to the Constitution, the logic of those who adopted the Constitution is very apparent from the speeches, the Constituent Assembly debates, which are all public and everyone can read them. And Dr. Ambedkar, whom the ruling party does pay a lot of lip service to, openly said that the whole point about democracy is that the majority can't simply do what it wants. And he specifically criticized the notion that a communal majority could ride roughshod over other communities. So I'm a bit taken aback by what my learned friend Chopin has said, because in fact, that goes completely against the grain of what the Constitution actually stands for. And that is the idea of India. The Nehruvian consensus involves other matters of policy, foreign policy, economic policy, and so on which there are legitimate possibilities of disagreement. But the fundamental notion of Indianness, the idea of India, that to use Tagore's phrase with which we begin our show, that to my mind is non-negotiable. And it's shocking to me that we are celebrating majoritarian bigotry by saying popular sentiment, by which is seemingly intended popular prejudices. One of the objectives of a humane, civilized constitutional structure ought to be to put prejudices in their place and treat all citizens equally, irrespective of caste or religion.
But can I ask you this? Are you saying, Dr. Tharoor, therefore, that it's not about the Nehruvian consensus, it's about a notion of constitutional morality, which or just constitution itself, which you believe is therefore under threat at the moment by what you call majoritarianism? But give me an example. When you say today that you fear that the Ambedkarite vision for the Constitution is under threat 73 years later, give me a concrete example of something that leads you to that apprehension.
Well, the most blatant example is the most recent one of the Citizenship Amendment Act, which for the first time in Indian legislative history has actually introduced a religious test for citizenship, of eligibility for citizenship, which is a flagrant violation of a cardinal principle of the Constitution. But it goes back over the period of years. I mean, even something seemingly routine like the criminalization of triple talaq. Triple talaq was already illegal in our country. The Supreme Court had declared it illegal. But to actually go and make it criminal when, for example, a Hindu husband abandoning a wife, deserting a wife without paying compensation or alimony or whatever is not criminalized, that again, perhaps more subtly signal the same sort of prejudice. That's the essential issue that I see at fault with the majoritarian prejudices that we are seeing exercised on the very top of our governing structure.
Swapan Dasgupta, the words which are being used by Dr. Tharoor reflect words like prejudice. He seems to suggest that you are confusing popular sentiment with the need for ensuring constitutional morality. At the end of the day, when you say today popular sentiment is pushing us in the direction in which we are going, is that what a democracy is about? That if you win a majority, the majority can therefore establish its supremacy over other groups?
Well, firstly, I would think that the term, the disdain with my friend Shashi has viewed this whole assertion of popular sovereignty, and I use the word popular sovereignty quite emphatically, it suggests a certain measure of condescension, that it suggests that any change any direction of India must necessarily be top down, that it can never be bottom up. There were the Constitution is a very, very important document as far as the evolution of Indian democracy is concerned. Its importance should never be minimized. But what the Constitution does is the Constitution sets out the rules of the game of what governs public life. It sets down various basic principles which governs politics, which governs the system of democracy, the political regime in which we operate in. Now, there is something little more than the Constitution. And I fear sometimes that what my friend Shashi is suggesting is that Indian nationhood starts from 1950. If he does suggest that, and I hope he doesn't, it would be a very wrong interpretation of what we are all about and what the idea of India, which he so strongly articulates, is all about. I think there is a deeper India. There is an India which goes back far deeper, which goes into, which is a continuum between, it starts from antiquity and stretches on to modernity now. I think that India, we must incorporate various strands of that. Shashi mentioned the criminalization of triple talaq. Now, I think he may have his own misgivings over that particular piece of legislation, and he's entitled to it. I would, however, point out that, for example, sati in India was outlawed at the time of Lord William Bentinck and Raja Ram Mohan Roy. They played a seminal contribution in undertaking that piece of legislation. But why is it that in the middle 70s, we again put in further restrictions on the practice of sati? Because one particular incident happened in Rajasthan. Criminalization happened. So criminalization of certain regressive practices, in my view, is nothing extraordinary. It's nothing unusual. It has happened in the case of the Hindu community. It's happened in the case of some other communities, in another community as far as the triple talaq is concerned. As far as the Ram Mandir is concerned, I think we were very careful. I think if you notice that in his speech at the Bhumi Pujan in Ayodhya, the Prime Minister spoke about it as a symbol of modernity. What he meant, therefore, was that if you were to view it purely as a temple where only puja is offered to Bhagwan Ram, you'll be actually missing the wood for the trees. What it does, however, is establish that very important linkage between a very important aspect of Indian tradition and Indian beliefs, and links it to how we are seeing it, connects it to the modern age. Okay. And I think that importance of nationhood, that sense of nationhood, where we are seeking to link the past, the present, and the future. I mean, I would use the
words. So you're saying to me, Dr. Dasgupta, that, sorry to intervene, that nationhood for you doesn't start with 1950 or 1947. It predates that. You believe Absolutely. That this is that the notion of nationhood must connect antiquity to the present. Am I correct?
Absolutely, you're not only right, and I think I would emphasize that India did not begin in either 1950 or 1947. India is a far older construct. India incorporates far more greater traditions. And I would use the words of Edmund Burke to illustrate the point that actually it's really the arrangement and a contract between the living, the dead, and the unborn. Okay. And I think that's precisely how we are proceeding in the lines of nationhood. We are taking it down, we are moving it from a top-down thing. It had its utility in a particular phase of Indian history, but I think we are evolving into something, a deeper, a sense of nationhood, coming with a sense of self-assertion, self-confidence.
Okay, I'll come to the top-down approach in a moment, but because there is criticism of that also in the present regime. But Dr. Tharoor, respond to what you're hearing, that notions of nationhood must connect antiquity to the present. It can't start from 1947 or 1950.
You know, I actually don't disagree with Chopin, because I've argued in my book, An Era of Darkness, and I will be arguing it further in my new book, The Battle of Belonging, that Indianness is not a modern construct. It goes back to the very, very ancient past. And I share completely his notion that we have to connect our ancient traditions with our present realities as a civilization. But at the same time, our nationalism birthed a modern republic. And that is what has given us the structure of our political rights and our functioning. In the old days, in fact, the nationalist movement had many of the characteristics of classic ethno-cultural nationalism. The Indian people harking back to the ancient civilization, fighting for self-determination against the foreign oppressor. But since independence and with the writing of a secular and liberal democratic constitution, our nationalism has been converted into a form of what I call, what is widely called civic nationalism. That is that we have a set structure of rights, duties as citizens of today's India, which is quite different from the rights we may or may not have enjoyed under the Mauryan Empire or the Mughal Empire or whatever. And that is not the notion of citizenship and nationhood that is present in the Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan sentiment in large portions of the ruling circles of our country. Because the attempt, in other words, to convert this liberal constitutionalism that has been the bedrock of the idea of India, of Indian nationalism since 1947, into, or since 1950, if Chopin would prefer, into a combination of religious, linguistic, and cultural nationalism, its liberal democratic trappings increasingly discarded in the pursuit of some sort of loyal conformity that suits the dominant establishment. I find that extremely troubling, but that's what the people who are ruling the country today see as true nationalism. And I think this is a debate worth having. August 15th is the right time to start it. I hope that Chopin and I will engage further as these ideas come forth, because at least in Chopin, the right has somebody who can think and articulate thoughtfully on these matters. But the fact is that for the most part, others of the ruling dispensation tend to say, we are nationalists, and if you articulate something else, you're anti-national. Since when does defending the Constitution and the idea of Indian nationhood and Indian citizenship inherent in the Constitution become anti-national? But that's what's happening to us today.
You know, therefore, are we talking of two different visions, Dr. Dasgupta, somewhere? The constitutional nationalism vision as is being articulated by Dr. Tharoor, and a Hindutva nationalism vision that includes elements of cultural and territorial nationalism as advocated by the likes of Savarkar, which today the BJP in a way subscribes to. Therefore, there are, you know, there is a constitutional civic nationalism, to use another word used by Dr. Tharoor, versus notions of Hindutva or popular nationalism, to words used by you.
There is civic nationalism, and I'm very glad, I'm very flattered that Shashi really treats my arguments with a measure of seriousness. There is, of course, a civic nationalism which exists. There also exists a cultural nationalism. I think there is a place for both. If the Constitution sets out the parameters on which civic nationalism must be governed, there's larger sense of nationhood, which considers India a sacred geography, for instance. That too is a part of what we might call cultural nationalism. Shashi mentioned in great detail the traditions of the national movement, and I'm fully one with him in actually agreeing that there were various strands of Indian nationalism. It was never the battle of liberal constitutionalism which dominated. It was never liberal constitutionalism which was the only strand of India. Now, for instance, you're very familiar, as Rajdeep, you must be very familiar with the debates which mark the disagreements between Lokmanya Tilak and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Now that, to my mind, actually summed up in one way what it was all about. How Jawaharlal Nehru's nationalism was also contested in a large way by the actual mobilization on the ground. How the notion of Bharat Mata arose out of Vande Mataram, which actually depicted India in the guise of a goddess. Durga was really what the imagery which set out by Kim Chandra. Now, are we going to say that nationalism is illegitimate in the context? That nationalism, because it had cultural connotations, which in Bengal we are very proud of, is somehow deemed to be unacceptable in today's notion of...
No, but it cannot lead, surely it cannot lead, Dr. Dasgupta, to, in today's India, cultural supremacy. In a Republican constitution, it cannot lead to cultural supremacy, wherein the sense is that one community gets citizenship or other benefits that others don't. Citizenship Amendment Act being a prime example of that. Are we very clear on that?
I'm glad you mentioned the Citizenship Amendment Act, because that benefits the victims of partition in Eastern India, in West Bengal, the principal beneficiaries, the people who were turfed out of that part which was called East Pakistan at one time, which and subsequently.
But it links citizenship to religion.
And they are the principal beneficiaries. There is no question about it, that those are the people who had a certain faith in India, in Mother India, who saw themselves as, who viewed India as the motherland. I think we have a historic obligation to them, and I'm glad that the CAA accommodated them.
Even if it redefines citizenship by linking it to religion.
It does not, I emphasize this point, take away the citizenship of even a single individual who are citizens of India, who have been born and who, irrespective of the different faiths they may subscribe to. What it does is it incorporates those who've been turfed out on account of their faith by people who rejected this notion of Bharat Mata, who rejected Indian nationalism.
Okay.
And are we to say, Shashi, would Shashi agree and say that we have no obligation towards those people, those unfortunate people, including, for example, those Afghans who were actually victims of, those Sikh Afghans who were victims of a dastardly attack by the Taliban only recently?
Shashi Tharoor, notion, how do you see this notion of citizenship? Are you being alarmist when you raise these issues? Are you being sort of going back into the fears of a Savarkarite Hindutva version? At the end of the day, do you believe that electoral democracy will force even those who were seen as extreme to eventually moderate and mainstream themselves when it comes to citizenship?
No, I think that, first of all, I think Chopin deserves an answer for asking whether I would have denied access to Indian citizenship to the persecuted of other nations. Not only would I not have, but Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru at that time said they are welcome to come to our country. They certainly have a claim on us. All that we were saying, and all that I continue to say, is that there should not have been a religious spelling out in the law as to which communities could avail of this. It should have been quite simply anybody persecuted in a neighboring country coming to India would be eligible for asylum and eventually citizenship. That was something that I could support because that fits into the principle of liberal constitutionalism that does not discriminate between people of different faiths. That is where I part company with Chopin on this one, because of course we should give a home to somebody who's persecuted because he's a Hindu or because he's a Sikh, but we should also give asylum to a Muslim who's persecuted because he has heretical beliefs or because of his political views. We've seen bloggers, Muslim bloggers, being murdered in Bangladesh. If one of them managed to escape and come across the border, would their religion suddenly mean they're on a slow lane to protection in our country? I mean, these are questions that go to the heart of what our rights inherent in our Constitution are and to whom they apply and how they're applied. That's why I objected to the CAA. Of course, I have larger, broader concerns, and I'm sorry, Radeep, I've gone off slightly from your question because I wanted to respond to Chopin. Do you mind repeating the thrust of your
My thrust is the notion of citizenship. How do you see this notion of citizenship in 2020? What does it mean in flesh and blood?
For me, it's very, very clear. If the Indian state accords you its protection and in the process does not ask you which religion you are, which language you speak, which state you live in, etc., but has objective, neutral tests that apply to all, that is citizenship, and that gives you certain rights certainly codified in the Constitution that are also rights protected and guaranteed by the state. Now, what is happening right now is, I mean, fortunately, Chopin was able to make the argument he made because the threat explicitly voiced by the Home Minister to link the CAA to an NRC nationwide was then withdrawn in the face of the nationwide protests. But initially, that was very much the plan. That, of course, the country is full of people who can't demonstrate documentation to prove their citizenship, including a minister, a famous minister in the government who went to the Supreme Court about the fact that his date of birth could not be demonstrated. Now, in this situation, Under the CAA-NRC combination that was threatened, the immediate conclusion people drew was that only Muslims who couldn't prove their documentation would be under a cloud, whereas Hindus and Sikhs and Parsis and so on, enumerated in the CAA, would be allowed to remain because they had a right to remain in India anyway. Now, this kind of thing is what completely vitiates the notion of a democratic Indian citizenship that applies equally to all. Now, fortunately, the Prime Minister and the Home Minister put the NRC aside for the moment, but the principle remains the same. We are not saying, I'm not saying that my Indianness is not tied up to the Indic, to the ancient values of my civilization. Right. All of that is part of who I am. But my rights as a modern citizen, the rights and duties conferred by the state and guaranteed by the Constitution are non-negotiable, whatever my religion or my mother tongue or anything may be.
Therefore, let me just take this in conclusion to you, Dr. Dasgupta. This is the wider principle of the idea of India nationhood. The question also arises in terms of practice. There's a sense of a creeping authoritarianism, whether it's parliament, whether it's Supreme Court, whether it's the executive, indeed whether it's the media. There's a sense that Moditva is about one-person authoritarianism, a creeping authoritarianism which in a sense militates against the very notion of freedom and independence of the individual, where collective identities in a way are given primacy at one level, but the individual remains supreme. We have creeping authoritarianism. How do you respond to that?
I'm reminded of a remark which Niraj Chaudhary made in the 1950s in an article in The Spectator, where he said, India is a dictatorship. He wrote it in the 1950s. India is a dictatorship, and the only person who doesn't realize it is Mr. Nehru himself. Now, these sort of alarmist comments have been made periodically. The only time India came near about to being a dictatorship was in the brief period of the emergency when under Indira Gandhi, when for personal considerations she removed all civil liberties. Apart from that, India has never come anywhere within smelling distance of being an authoritarian state. Now, we have seen a leader who's intensely popular, who's intensely charismatic, who has certain leadership skills, who commands the inherent faith of the majority of the electorate. Now, that leadership is now being questioned by people. Why do we have a strong leadership? Now, we have people who actually believe that the will of Parliament, the majority will of Parliament, should necessarily be always contested and overturned by the Supreme Court. Now, when the Supreme Court says we will not undertake such a political role, that is not part of our brief, now we say, oh dear, the Supreme Court, the courts, the judiciary has been compromised. And so on and so forth. There is no authoritarianism in this country. There is a usual jostle of competitive politics. And I just want to make that last point about the notion of citizenship, which Shashi mentioned. Now, what we have, and we'll come to the NRC bridge when we approach it, the moment it doesn't exist. The issue here was a special purpose vehicle was actually introduced to fast track those whose citizenship, whose status in India had been left outstanding for a very, very long time. And it is that the larger norms of citizenship, which is non-discriminatory, which applies to everyone, still exist on the statute books and has not been touched at all. What I think really we are seeing what is at the heart of this debate which is going on is that for a lot of people, and I don't necessarily include Shashi in that, for a lot of people who are advocates, who are very belligerent advocates of so-called constitutional patriotism, history must be eradicated and life, year zero, starts from 1950. Now that, to my mind,
you made that point earlier, Dr. Dasgupta.
Perspective which we will very, very robustly contest, both intellectually and politically.
Let me ask you that then, Dr. Tharoor. One of the primary fears, according to Dr. Dasgupta, it's alarmist, is of a creeping authoritarianism, that Modi's India, in a way, is an authoritarian India, and therefore freedoms are being circumscribed at various levels, institutional and individual. Do you believe that, or are you being alarmist?
No, no, I certainly believe that there is a real problem of hollowing out of our institutions. We've seen, unfortunately, the use of mob violence and riots targeting Muslims, cow vigilantism has been called. We've seen the disposal of Article 370, the promotion of Moditva, the personality cult around the Prime Minister, the remaking of the national ethos in many ways. All of these
Swapan
things
Dasgupta calls it strong leadership. He says it's strong leadership, not authoritarian leadership.
Strong leadership and the value thereof will certainly be judged ultimately by the results. And I think there, at the moment, the jury is not in very good shape on Mr. Modi's results, whether it comes to the economy, whether it comes to national security, whether it comes to COVID management. But that's a different conversation altogether. I want to say that going back to the Constitution, it is constitutional democracy that has given Indians of every imaginable caste, creed, culture, and cause the chance to fulfill their aspirations. And that rests on a core assumption of nationalism, the development and strengthening of free institutions that ensure pluralism, protect diversity, guarantee the integrity of the state. And those are being hollowed out. So authoritarianism is not a work that's completed. It's a work, sadly, in progress. Let me just add, going back to Chopin's point about the whole historical underpinnings of Indianness. Yes, the India that was fought for by the blood of our forefathers and finally rebirthed in the crucible of our national struggle, the fundamental premise that was forged there was that of access to a historically inalienable set of freedoms. The freedom to choose what government you want, the freedom to choose what set of convictions you may have, the freedom to choose who to love, how to love, the freedom to choose what to wear, to eat, to drink, to speak, the freedom to move freely within your sovereign borders, and the freedom to choose whether Ram or Rahim or Jesus or Jehovah was the force that guided and moved the cosmos. All of these freedoms enshrined in our Constitution are embedded not just in the letter and spirit of the law, but I believe in the lived experience of India and its peoples. So when I speak about liberal constitutionalism or constitutional civic nationalism, I'm not talking about something invented in 1950. It's something that was codified in 1950, but is part of the essential reality of India. This is how most of our people have always lived. The Constitution has merely created something that enshrines that. And frankly, to see our present government remaking the country into a populist, communalist, chauvinist, slickly marketed and power-hungry kakistocracy supported by stoked-up vigilante mobs, all in the name of a democratically elected government and at the expense of those public institutions that were intended to safeguard the rights of all Indians, that's pretty saddening, Rajiv. And on this 73rd Independence Day, I think it's something that we really do need to guard against and protect our idea of India.
You know, I can see Dr. Dasgupta dying to dive in, and as I said, I don't want any crosstalk. And I want to end on a happier note in a moment, but you want to quickly respond before I end on a happier note. Yes.
Very a quick word. I mean, I'm so reminded of Lewis Carroll. Yes, it sounds so nice, but what does it mean? Where in your lived experience are you getting authoritarianism? Where in your lived experience are you seeing this complete destruction of everything Indian? And I just want to add that got one more thing in this thing about what the freedom struggle was all about. It was also, of course, it was all about what he mentioned. It was also about one more thing, which was the recovery of national sovereignty, which had been lost for a very, very long time.
You know, you asked Dr. Das,
and therefore it was also the recovery of national identity, which was very much a part of a freedom struggle, which never ended really in 1947 or 1950, but shall continue, I think, till India discovers itself.
Dr. Dasgupta, when dissent is criminalized, those who dissent against the government are described as anti-national, arrested under UAPA, when, as we see, contempt charges...
Are you talking about West Bengal?
No, 1 minute.
Are you talking about West Bengal?
No, it's across the country. Look, at the end of the day, we've seen numerous examples, whether they're human rights activists, whether they are poets, whether they are lawyers, all of them being targeted in some form or the other of the state. What binds them together is criticism of the government. So when you say that you want examples of authoritarianism, a number of them can be given. Obviously, there's also the fear of religious majoritarianism when you have cow vigilantes who are allowed to get away with their action. That's only one example of it. So, or when people, politicians decide on, during public speeches, in a way, describe someone on the basis of the clothes they wear or how they look. I think these are troubling aspects which we need to look at. But as I said, I want to end on a happier note. And the happier note is that both Shashi Tharoor and Swapan Dasgupta are Stephanians from the batch of 72 to 75. And correct me, gentlemen, if I'm wrong, the two of you met on a train from Kolkata to Delhi all those years ago. Your ideologies may differ, but your alumnus is one and the same. So I'm going to ask you something more positive to end on, which is, what is the best thing about being Indian? I want 30 seconds from you, Dr. Dasgupta, and then I'll give Dr. Tharoor the final word. What's the best thing on this Independence Day weekend about being Indian? What you treasure the most about this country?
To breathe the free air of India, to realize that you're part of a very, very exciting journey where India has started to count and matter in the world community, that we can actually raise our heads high and say to others that we are very proud to be Indians. That, to my mind, is the most significant feature about this independence.
Are you saying that that started in 2014 only?
I did not say that. That is what you're saying.
You seem to suggest that.
I said that is what you're saying. I said what is great about Independence Day today is this, and I can breathe the free air. I can proudly hold up my head and say I'm an Indian, a very self-confident Indian. And if I was to use a cricketing metaphor, I would say that here is an India which is really on top of the cricketing world as well. That is a personal...
I might point out that India became the world's best test team when UPA 2 was in power, but that's another issue. I didn't want to get into UPA.
You would say that, right?
No, I didn't want to get into that. I was just correcting you. We won the World Cup also in 2011. But go ahead, Shashi Tharoor. What's the best thing about being Indian?
Well, let me surprise Swapan by agreeing with him, except that I would say that the Independence Day is an occasion to look at that flag and feel a shared patriotism that embraces every Indian in a common narrative of hope. What I don't see, unfortunately, in the policies of the government and the party he's defending is that willingness to embrace every Indian, irrespective of their background. I might add, by the way, when you reminisced about us meeting on a train, Rajdeep, back in, I think it was May or June of 72, as heading to St. Stephen's College, all I can say is that Chopin started the journey as a Trotskyite and ended up as a Hindutva ideologue. He's been brilliantly intellectually impressive on both sides of the spectrum. I have stayed where I was, which was in the center, and I must say, the parties I may have admired may have changed over time as India has evolved. But Chopin has made a longer journey around, and that's something else to love about India, that one can make these intellectual journeys and still find common ground. And my common ground is in celebrating with him that narrative of hope, provided it embraces all Indians equally.
Well, as you said, and both of you are...
When facts change, yes, opinions change. At least in my case. I don't know about you, Shashi.
No, you're to the left of me, now you're to the right of me. So my position hasn't changed a lot. Well, we are.
Well, let's leave it there. India has space for left, right, and center. And hopefully the diversity of opinions will continue to flower and flourish. And even two people from the same college batch can have two contrasting opinions and yet debate and discuss in a civilized manner. One of the reasons we've done this is to show that it is possible on Indian television to still have a debate with civility and mutual respect, even while holding each other's positions very strongly. And perhaps that's the way we want to move forward. In 2020, let's bring back the spirit of Samvad, not necessarily always of Vivad. Thank you so much, Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Dr. Swapan Dasgupta. Have a happy Independence Day. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you.